Welcome to AE911Truth Webinars, everybody. I'm Richard Gage, founder and CEO of Architects and Engineers for 911Truth. And I'm very excited today to present a whole number of announcements to you at the end of our webinar, which today is focused on the Twin Towers. But first, I want to introduce you to our operations coordinator, Mr. Andy Steele.
Hi everybody, thank you again for tuning in to today's webinar. I just want to remind you, as I always do, that the pictures in the video screen default to a low resolution. You can't do anything about it, but you can. Just click the gear box beneath the video and select 720 HD resolution so you can see the images clear and crisp. And also, we will be taking questions related to today's subject, which is the Twin Towers. You can submit those questions simply by typing them in the box here on this page you're watching the video on, ae911truth.org/webinars. Just type the question in the box, hit submit, and we will be answering them later on in this webinar. Back to you, Richard.
Awesome, Andy. Thanks so much. And everybody, I'm really excited to come to you from our headquarters in Berkeley, California, with our presentation of 9/11 Blueprint for Truth, the Architecture of Destruction, where we are focusing on week number 4 of our 4-week series. And if you have not seen weeks 1 and 2, the World Trade Center evidence, I encourage you to look at those archives on our website at ae911truth.org, maybe right underneath the video feed that you're looking at right now, if you're online and on our website already. Otherwise, go to the website and click on AE911Truth Webinars and you'll find it. So that's World Trade Center 7. And then week 3, we started by introducing you to the World Trade Center explosive evidence. And today we'll be looking at the heat, the massive heat produced in this destruction, which is not accountable by the official story. Official story cannot account for that phenomena. Well, who am I? I've been an architect for 28 years, and I've worked on all kinds of larger projects, including these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums in the San Francisco Bay Area, and the $125 million high school, which I was responsible for the construction administration for in the San Francisco Bay Area, but more recently in the Las Vegas area. I worked on this $400 million mixed-use project with 6 blocks of retail, parking structure, and mid-rise office space, altogether over 1,200 tons of fireproofed steel framing. So, but I'm joined by 25,000 years of collective experience from the 2,700 now architects and engineers for 911Truth. I represent these dedicated individuals, dedicated to telling you the truth about what they learned and the evidence that they saw, that you're going to be looking at a snapshot of today in the next 45 minutes. Following last week's presentation, week 3 of the explosive destruction, where we looked at the sudden near freefall collapse of this structure, the high velocity lateral ejections landing 600 feet in every direction sent out 60 miles an hour laterally. What forces can produce that? That's what we looked at last week, causing the complete shattering of the steel frame down to the ground in under 12 seconds, and the midair pulverization of 90,000 tons of concrete. Well, what else do we have in the way of evidence? Well, extreme heat. Extreme heat that jet fuel and office fires cannot possibly cause. We'll be looking at pyroclastic-like clouds coming from this destruction, molten steel and iron, which It takes 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit, as we'll find out, to form iron microspheres ubiquitous in the dust, and the evidence of thermite and nanothermite. What is that? That's an incendiary that we're going to be looking at today. All this evidence is incendiary in the adjective sense of that word. Let's first take a step back, though, and find out what happened on that day on 9/11. How did this official story get developed?
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes had flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience. Elements of the myth: the impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire, that caused collapse.
Well, there's the official story in a nutshell. And where from? Right from the street itself, day one. And then, of course, we have these reports that sought to prove that official story with computer models, which we'll be getting to. As we look with the scientific method, a method we've had in the West for 100 years, which is us to, or helps us to winnow. What do? Well, we do some background research after we formulate a question. How did the towers come down? Well, how have other towers come down? We do some background research, we make observations, we construct a hypothesis or several hypotheses, the ones that are the most rational. What are they? Well, maybe fire, maybe explosions, since there's evidence of explosions. All the hypotheses are laid out, and we look at them dispassionately, objectively. We test them, having made predictions about them. We test those predictions with experiments. If this is true, what else could be true? Analyze the results, we draw conclusions. Now, if our hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner so all can build on the body of our work and understand that we're not hiding our basic assumptions in a black box to keep others from knowing what we've done to manipulate the data, as NIST has proven to have done, and will not release, for instance, their computer model for their input data, the input data for the computer model for World Trade Center 7, citing, well, this would jeopardize public safety. Wait a minute. Public safety is jeopardized by you. But we'll come back to some of the other NIST examples of not telling the complete story and hiding the evidence that does exist. As we're going to apply the scientific method ourselves, how have other towers came down? Well, we looked extensively at the typical field, which include a sudden onset of destruction. The base of the structure is straight down, symmetrical collapse into its footprint. 3, demolition waves remove column supports. 4, a free fall speed through the path of greatest resistance. 5, total dismemberment of the steel structure, broken up, ready for loading and shipment. 6, minimal damage to adjacent structures. 7, sounds and flashes of explosives heard and seen by witnesses. Focused on that last week. And 8, enormous clouds of pulverized concrete. 9, explosive charges visible at the upper floors. Isolated explosive ejections called squibs. We looked at that last week. And what we're going to be looking at this week is number 10, chemical evidence. Explosive or incendiary destruction. Fire can't create any one of these, let alone all 10 of them. We're going to be looking at additional corroborative evidence, government documentation, experts corroboration. Yeah, it's a controlled demolition. At least those experts who don't have biases given the $100,000 contracts that they have with, say, the federal government, whose official story we're challenging. But those who are independent and less beholden to U.S. sources, such as last week we looked at Danny Jowenko, the top European controlled demolition experts. That was a couple of weeks ago in week 1 or 2. Video documentation and foreknowledge. This is all proof, can help us to determine a proof of controlled demolition. With that in mind, let's look at the features of the destruction of the Twin Towers. Well, we looked at the first 7 of 10 last week. This week, we're going to focus on number 8, 9, and 10, starting with enormous pyroclastic clouds of pulverized concrete. Well, the National Fire Protection Association guide NFPA 921, it's the guide for investigation of fire and explosions. Hey, it says look for thermal effects. That's what we're looking at today. Last week we looked at blast pressure wave effects, shrapnel effects, seismic effects. This week we're looking at thermal effects. Large volumes of gas and the large amount of heat released in chemical explosions cause rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases. Well, this occurs before, during, and directly after the final destruction of the Twin Towers. You're looking at them here, the plumes of hot gases, more clearly seen here, trailing these laterally ejected structural steel sections, these thick white plumes, as you see here, much hotter than the fires that, in the case of the South Tower, were actually almost out. So where is all this heat coming from that's causing this rapidly expanding cauliflower-like plumes during the following the complete collapse of the building? This is indicative of extreme heat, which the people running away from these clouds were experiencing again and again. This was a very, very hot event. That is the evidence we're showing you today. Covering lower Manhattan with suspended concrete powder in the air. Suspended in the air, dropping a blanket of powdered concrete across lower Manhattan, which we'll be looking at what is in that concrete as well, that blanket of powdered concrete. Extremely rapidly expanding cauliflower plumes are not caused by fires or gravitational collapses. This is very important. We've seen plenty of examples of collapses. Yes, they produce dust. They do not produce rapidly expanding cauliflower-like plumes. This is pyroclastic-like clouds produced from expanding heat. Well, we're going to be looking also here at the evidence of this heat as we look at iron microspheres, for instance, and evidence of extreme high temperature phenomena in the debris piles, again, before, during, and after the final destruction of these buildings. Well, Bechtel documents 2,800 degree temperatures. Now, this is the melting point of iron or steel. These fires are maybe 4, 5, 6, 700. NIST claims actually 1,800 degrees fires without any evidence to back that up. In fact, it contradicts their own findings that they have no evidence for 500 degree Fahrenheit temperatures on the steel in the area associated with the hottest fires, jet plane impacts. So we don't know how they get away with suggesting that these fires were 1,800 degrees, but still this cannot possibly account for red hot molten running this debris past the columns, as Richard Garlock, who worked directly for the World Trade Center structural engineer Leslie Robertson, documents. Well, what do the first responders and the demolition contractors say about this molten metal? Well, Peter Tully, the president of the Tully Construction, the lead contractor for the site cleanup, says saw pools of literally molten steel. Wow, where did that come from? It was dripping from the molten steel, says this firefighter, this beam. Seeing the molten steel, uncovering red hot metal beams, says this veteran of these other disasters and first responder. Well, let's look at this molten metal pouring out of the South Tower 10 minutes prior to its collapse. This is not molten aluminum. Molten aluminum looks silvery in daylight conditions because NIST says, oh, this must be melted airplane. No, this is what melted airplane looks like. Well, ranging from molten metal, which was still reeks after the event. Streams of molten metal that leaked from the hot cores and flowed down, says this author and journalist. And this firefighter, metal dripping from a beam, dripping molten steel. Vice President. Well, here is a photograph of the dripping molten falling metal. The evidence is overwhelming here, but the explanation is not. We'll hear an explanation or an attempt to debunk this from NIST themselves. But the FEMA, for the author for the FEMA report, Jonathan Barnett, fire protection engineer, says there were partially evaporated beams, steel members in the debris pile that appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. What's the explanation? There is none, but they've never seen it. These first responders have never seen molten metal flowing, never seen beams like this. But this structural engineer, Abulhassan Astani Azal, who had unlimited access to the Fresh Kills landfill, documents this piece of World Trade Center 7 steel. And just like the fire protection engineer, Jonathan Barnett, says, partly evaporated. No explanation. But plenty of documentation. In fact, Appendix C of the FEMA report that came out in May of 2002 is a complete metallurgical examination of the few pieces of steel that were saved. Those pieces were documented, and they find Swiss cheese appearance, solid steel girder turned to Swiss cheese, eutectic reactions, intergranular melting. We'll come back to that. But this piece of steel, secured by John Gross himself from NIST, whom we're going to hear from in a moment, shows rapid oxidation, sulfidation, and melting of iron. Yes, a liquid iron. What is liquid iron? It is iron that has exceeded its melting point of 2,800 degrees. What can do that? sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. They have no explanation for where the sulfur came from. We'll be looking at a plausible explanation in a moment. It burned. The smell of sulfur and everything else. Never block out that smell. It haunts me. That sulfur burning, says this cleanup worker, demolition worker at Ground Zero. Well, FEMA documents this mysterious sulfidation, which the New York Times says is perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation. Yet it's completely ignored by NIST. The sulfur lowers the melting point of steel, becomes much more effective, which we'll be looking at. Well, what else melted? Concrete melted. In fact, this chunk of concrete melted like lava, formed itself around this weapon in the police station down under World Trade Center 6. I didn't even know concrete could melt. 3,000 degrees it takes concrete to begin to melt. 3,200. Wow. Well, what else melted? A lot of meteorites, they call them. They're pulled up from deep in the pile.
One of the more unusual artifacts to emerge from the rubble is this rock-like object that has come to be known as the meteorite.
It's this fused element of steel, molten steel and concrete and all of these things all fused by the heat.
And architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
Doesn't it warrant an investigation which can explain the melting of steel and concrete? No, it's just ignored by NIST, but we're not ignoring it. In fact, we know it's not aluminum because aluminum doesn't rust. So it's iron or steel. Well, interesting. We'll come back to that. We know that the temperatures based on these flights by NASA in the infrared sensitive camera thermal mapping show temperatures exceeding 1,340 degrees at World Trade Center 7, 1,160 degrees Fahrenheit at World Trade Center 1, and on the South Tower, almost 1,400 degrees. Guess what? These are surface temperatures. There's no fire on the surface of these piles. This is the radiated temperature from deep within the pile that surely at its source must have been twice or three times these temperatures, which is what the evidence we're looking at also verifies. Yet no investigation into these extreme hot temperatures. In fact, listen to John Gross deny this evidence. He's the co-project leader or the lead engineer of the NIST report.
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, no eyewitness who said so, and they would have produced it.
But witnesses do testify otherwise.
Get down below and you see molten steel running down the channelways, like you're in a foundry. Yeah. Like lava.
The volcano actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall. And the cleanup was very difficult in the beginning. The steel was coming out red in certain areas from the first couple of weeks.
This fused element of steel, molten steel.
They pulled out the big block of concrete, and there was like a little river of steel flowing.
Leslie, structural engineer for the World Trade Center himself, is saying that there was a river of steel flowing. Is he a credible witness? World Trade Center fires, according to Thomas Iger, are 1,200 degrees. He's a supporter of the official story. NIST claims 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. But structural steel doesn't even begin to melt until 2,800 degrees almost. What can create the temperatures required to melt steel? we're going to look at thermite. High jet fuel burning in open air can only produce temperatures up to about a degree without any evidence, but certainly steel melted during this event. So what caused this steel or iron to melt? Here's John Gross on the pile of this disaster, cutting out the very piece of steel used to document the Swiss cheese appearance of this steel, and yet he's denying all over the evidence. Well, let's look. Could thermite have produced all that molten metal? What is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited is 2 seconds. Thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center's steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide have formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Fascinating. Maybe we're getting somewhere. Now, we have a possible source, which, if it can be concluded that it exists here, can explain the extreme temperatures, can explain the hot sulfur corrosion attack on the steel, and can explain this molten iron or steel that exists here that we just saw plenty of evidence for. But can we prove that it was there? That's what we're going to be looking at. Well, the NFPA 921 itself, the Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigation, says, look for unusual residues that could arise from thermite or pyrotechnic materials when you have evidence of these extreme temperatures. But NIST acknowledges that it never looked for such evidence after denying that it existed. They said in writing, well, we never really looked for it. Wow. They refused to look for it still. But other independent scientists look for it, including Stephen Jones, who says if there was thermite, you'd be looking for unique chemical evidence left behind in the residue. Common elements such as iron, aluminum, copper, calcium, silicon, but more unusual elements as well, fluorine and manganese left behind in the residue. These elements on the periodic table of the elements, which we're all familiar with from middle school, well, somebody sent a chunk of this 40-pound piece of molten metal. He goes to work and he finds through electron microprobe data that it's predominantly iron. So he can rule out molten aluminum from the jet planes. It has abundant manganese. So he can rule out molten structural steel as a major component. It has small amounts of aluminum, sulfur, and potassium, key ingredients of thermite. Well, manganese and fluorine in abundance. Fascinating. What about these? Well, manganese is from potassium permanganate. It's commonly used as an oxidizer in thermite, so that can explain it. Fluorine is used in very special thermite charges called sol gels, so that can explain it. So these are often present in the residue and constitute a thermite fingerprint. Well, he goes on and looks at a second sample from this 9/11 monument, and the previously molten metal samples, slag clinging to the structural steel. He does X-ray fluorescence and analyzes it, finds iron, sulfur, potassium, manganese, key ingredients of thermite. And as shown in this piece of WTC7 steel, which is not a oxyacetylene torch cut. They go straight through. In fact, they look like this. Oxyacetylene torches that the cleanup workers were using, the iron workers at the site, look like that. They don't look like this. And with abundant aluminum which is one of the ingredients of thermite, and part of the residue when it's not converted to aluminum oxide in a full, complete reaction. Well, this monument at the International Steel Park, he looks at also, and there's evidence of aluminum. In fact, the XEDS, X-ray dispersive spectroscopy analysis of this slag residue at the International Peace Park from Manitoba shows the signature of thermite. In fact, thermite can be used to cut through steel, has been. There's patented devices we'll show you, but in your own backyard, if you're as resourceful as civil engineer John Cole, you can make your own shaped cutter charges and use them to cut through steel with thermite and thermate as he did. Take a look. Cutting through, and he documents razor sharpness, just like was documented by FEMA on the ends of the steel beams, partially evaporated. In fact, yes, there are patented cutter charges which are much more effective at cutting through steel even than high energy explosives like C4 and RDX, which are more commonly used in controlled demolitions. This one cuts through in hundreds of milliseconds, ejecting a stream of molten iron. But it's very expensive, so you'd need a budget to use this material. But in a deceptive controlled demolition, which we're looking at least 3 on 9/11 at the World Trade Center, you might not want the loud bangs and the bright flashes associated with typical controlled demolitions, especially if you're wanting to blame the destruction of these buildings on fires. So you might use something like this, but it has its own set of evidence that's left behind, which we've been looking at. In fact, there are patented devices which use consolidated thermite as the casing for destructive devices, and in this case, an igniter. But the entire casing is consumed in the use of this material. All that's left behind is a pool of molten iron, which we've documented at the World Trade Center. Sol gels, if they were used, would leave a residue also, 1,3-diphenyl propane. Well, what about this? This is very, very unusual. In fact, the EPA documents one molecule at levels that dwarfed all others, 1,3-diphenyl propane. We've never observed it in any other sampling we've ever done, says Eric Schwartz of the EPA. But there it is. And it's unexplained. As is the other material that was found in the dust through a 3-square-mile area of lower Manhattan in a 4-inch thick blanket. The iron microspheres documented by the billions in all the dust samples. R.J. Lee, doing toxicological studies, finds that this is primarily iron. In fact, it's elemental iron. It is not melted steel. This is elemental iron. 10 tons of droplets of elemental iron. This is not some small quantity of elemental iron. Iron has not been used, elemental iron, in columns for almost 100 years in high-rise construction. We use very complex steel alloys, which have iron, of course, as their predominant component. But this is pure elemental iron droplets, documented not only by R.J. Lee, but by the U.S. Geological Survey. They're everywhere. They're ubiquitous. Up to 6% of the dust samples are composed of these unexplained elemental iron, previously molten droplets, the diameter of a human hair on average. Most of them you can't even see in all this dust. In fact, there's so many of them, they're used as a signature component to identify that this is uniquely World Trade Center dust. This is not background dust. So this is very, very unique. Dr. Stephen Jones also documents this in his paper, Evidence of Extreme Heat. R.J. Lee documents it very, very carefully, but doesn't explain where these elemental iron microspheres came from. Well, here's how they're produced. This is thousands and thousands of molten iron droplets that cool and form these previously molten iron droplets in an experiment made by thermite. We learned that thermite is composed of iron oxide, which is basically rust, and fine aluminum powder. So that can explain this material and can explain the toasting of the tops of these cars, liquid falling molten iron droplets. What else can explain the toasting? Heat is what toasts. This is a hot event, toasting the tops of these cars. Okay, well, let's look for proof of where those iron droplets might have come from. Let's look at the World Trade Center dust, as did a team of international scientists led by Stephen Jones and Niels Harrit, who collected 7 altogether samples of this dust from donors in different areas. All of them, particularly the 4 that they focused on, had the same curious red-gray chips, about the 1/16 of an inch long, like this one, multi-layered, red on one side, gray on the other. They zoom in to the red side, and what do they find? The elements of thermite, aluminum, iron in particular, but also silicon, oxygen, carbon. Very interesting. What are the ingredients of thermite doing in these samples? They zoom in then to the red layer 50,000 times. What do they find? Nanoparticles of iron oxide crystals and aluminum platelets. Again, the elements of thermite, but 1,000 times smaller than the human hair, these particles in the percentage to become thermite. 3/4 iron oxide to 1/4 aluminum. These are set in an organic bed of oxygen, silica, carbon. Why? What is this material? Well, they put it in a differential scanning calorimeter, which is a heater, at about 420 centigrade, maybe 800-900 Fahrenheit. It ignites and produces temperatures exceeding the melting point of iron. In other words, this is an energetic material. Paint doesn't do this. Paint doesn't ignite at 420 degrees. Those who have tried to show that this is paint did not take their temperatures in their differential scanning calorimeter to this temperature for that reason, probably. So it did not ignite. And so we have previous examples from the research on this material that show that that's what happens with nanothermite, super thermite. It's an incendiary that's engineered to become more explosive. So when they did ignite it in the differential scanning calorimeter, what happened? Well, it produced hundreds of previously of molten iron microspheres. And guess what? With the same signature pattern, virtually, of the iron microspheres found in all the World Trade Center dust by the USGS, by R.J. Lee, and by others. In other words, this is an internally consistent set of evidence that's self-corroborating, that can explain all the elements of the destruction of the towers and the source of the iron microspheres themselves, as if we didn't know where these iron microspheres came from. They're found attached to partially ignited chips. The source is very, very clear. Why are they spheres? Well, when a liquid is dispersed through pressures such as explosions, it forms itself into a sphere, just like when you spray water out of a bottle. It atomizes. The surface tension forms it into a sphere, and they cool and they fall with all of the dust. And so here you have some examples of just that. It is called superthermite, and it does become more explosive. Why? Because of its extremely small size. When you reduce particles, explosive particles or incendiaries, to these extreme nanoparticle sizes, the surface volume is increased dramatically, allowing for instantaneous chemical reactions across the body of this material. So it does have more explosive properties, which is very interesting. This is not made in a cave in Afghanistan. This material is extremely high-tech, made only in the most sophisticated Defense Department contracting laboratories. So, you know, we have some sources of investigation that we can recommend. If anyone out there at a judicial level of authority or legislative level of authority or executive level of authority is willing to open their eyes, look at the evidence, and follow these leads wherever they take them. This particular research is documented in a 24-page peer-reviewed paper in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. It has not been contested by other peer-reviewed papers. And that's how you contest peer-reviewed papers. You don't wave your hands in the air, screaming loudly, "Oh, that's just paint." Well, paint doesn't have these exotic properties and experimental results. So it's not just paint. And we've shown, I believe, today, this week, focusing on number 8, 9, and 10, the direct evidence of explosive destruction at the Twin Towers and incendiaries in particular today. No characteristic of destruction by fire here. Fire can't explain any of these, let alone all 10 of them, as we've looked at last week and this week, with additional data, which is available on the internet from FEMA and the NIST reports. Like, for instance, the FEMA investigation, which Bill Manning, the editor of Fire Engineering magazine, calls a half-baked farce that may already have been commandeered by political forces, whose primary interest, to put it mildly, lie far afield of full disclosure. Wow. He says the structural damage from the planes and explosive ignition of the jet fuel in themselves are not enough to bring down the towers. Well, this is the engineering magazine, fire protection engineering magazine, that allows our fire protection engineers across our country to coordinate, have a body of work and evidence, experiments and articles that they can agree on and move forward with and create policy from. Yet the editor of that magazine is not listened to by our political forces, by NIST either, who did their own $20 million effort with 10,000 pages. What was their mission? To determine how and why World Trade Center 1 and 2 collapsed, and Building 7 as well, which we looked at in week 1 and 2. Well, they state that their objective, this is in the footnotes, that the focus of the investigation was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact to the initiation of collapse for each tower. For brevity in this report, this sequence is referred to as the probable collapse sequence, but it stopped at the initiation of collapse when the first sagging floor truss pulled in the first bending perimeter column, according to their theory. There's nothing, no analysis after that. In fact, they even say it does not actually include the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached, and collapse became, they claim, inevitable. Wait a minute. You mean you spent 10,000 pages, 20 years, 1,000 pages modeling the airplanes, every turbine in the plane, 100 pages modeling life safety issues. It's a bunch of ubiquitous, irrelevant detail that doesn't even explain, except for 1/2 page, the events following collapse initiation. Well, let's see what they say on that 1/2 page. The structure below the level of collapse initiation offered minimal resistance. The large building mass far exceeded the capacity of the intact structure below to absorb that. Well, that's all speculation. There's not one calculation showing the ability of the cold, hard, intact steel below the point of jet plane impacts to resist some falling block of building above the point of jet plane impacts. This is what structural engineers do for a living. They're fully capable of doing this. Why did they stop at the collapse initiation? Well, they say it came down essentially in free fall. Well, you're right about that. It's not an analysis. It should be called Final Report on the Initiation of Collapse. There's no analysis whatsoever. When called on this in writing, in our request for correction, 2007, they said, we're unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse of the Twin Towers. Yeah, that's for sure. Well, what do the experts say? Those who are willing to stand up and speak. Well, Ronald Brookman, structural engineer, says it doesn't look anything like a heat-induced gravitational collapse mechanism, the Twin Towers. Why complete collapse of the Twin Towers became inevitable is beyond me. He says, basically, why would all 110 stories drop straight down to the 10? Well, another structural engineer, William Rice, says it this way. The prevailing theory would have us believe that each of the Twin Towers inexplicably collapsed upon itself, crushing all 287 massive columns on each floor while maintaining a near freefall collapse, a near freefall acceleration, as if the 100,000 or more tons of supporting structural steel framework underneath didn't even exist. David Scott, another structural engineer, says, more simply, near freefall collapse violates laws of physics. Okay, that makes sense to me. And fire protection engineer Scott Granger says, all three collapses were very uniform in nature. Natural collapses due to unplanned events are not uniform. I get that too. Edward Muniak says, these collapses have no resemblance to any previous high-rise fire. Indeed, we learned in week 1, 2, and 3 that there's no evidence, well, there's no collapse of a high-rise structure due to fire ever, except the 3 that we have on 9/11. Even one of the FEMA study team members, author of Why Buildings Fall Down, said this.
You've seen many of the managed demolitions where they implode a building and they cause it essentially to fall vertically because they cause all of the vertical columns to fail simultaneously. That's exactly what it looked like, and that's what happened.
Wow, that's a damning indictment of the official story, but he's not going to be contradicting the official narrative anytime soon. Nor is Ronald Hamburger, who said before he became part of the FEMA team, it appeared to me that charges had been placed in the building. Upon learning that no bombs had been detonated, I was very surprised. How did he learn that no bombs had been detonated? And Why did he change his mind after he did learn that? How did his investigations never consider demolition? Well, we believe that we've shown that the hypothesis of controlled demolition is corroborated by the evidence and eyewitness testimony. We believe that we've shown that these 10 key characteristic and some uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition are direct evidence of the explosive destruction that fire cannot account for whatsoever. With additional circumstantial and corroborative evidence, we believe this is proof of controlled demolition beyond a reasonable doubt. If you're inclined to agree, we invite you to take some action with us. Work with us. Sign our petition at AE911Truth calling for a new investigation. Become a member of AE911Truth. You know, for the price of a cup of coffee a month or more, you can make a huge difference, because we have 2,000 members that give somewhere between $2.50 a month on up. That keeps us going. That keeps us in the face of the American Institute of Architects, where we secured 3 times the number of votes this year for a resolution calling upon the AIA to call for a new investigation of Building 7. That membership and those donations of yours are what's enabling us to go this year to New York on September 10th and 11th and create the most professional and impactful conference the 9/11 Truth movement has ever put together, with attorneys like Daniel Sheehan, the People's Advocate, Judge Impassamato, the honorary president of the Supreme Court of Italy, and other well-known attorneys like Bill Pepper, Michael Lebron from Lionel Radio in New York, and others are coming together to find out how we can secure justice on behalf of the victims of 9/11 and their families, how we can get the evidence that you've seen in the last 4 weeks into the legal realm in actual cases that are effective and that will force the evidence into the public record and force our leaders to take note of it and account for it. It's a turning point in the 9/11 Truth movement, and we're very excited about it. We want you to be there. On our website, AE911Truth, you'll see the banner that'll enable you to get your tickets to be there. And soon we'll be announcing the live streaming of this whole event with 2 cameras and a direct feed from the projector and a quality sound, which will be going up on YouTube after every session live that weekend. Very exciting. We also have volunteer opportunities for you, and I'd like to ask Andy for help on this one. Andy, what kinds of opportunities do we have for volunteers? What I'm aware of, we have lots of projects, for instance, an outreach to every civil engineer and member of the American Society of Civil Engineers, with a very special brochure that is designed to help people become self-aware. That came out 2 days after 9/11.
Right, and Richard, we have a ton of volunteer opportunities. Oh, go ahead. And I apologize for the interruption. We're having a little bit of a technical glitch here, so some of your words are coming to me a little late. But I just want to reiterate what Richard is saying. We have a ton of volunteer opportunities, Richard, and please feel free to go on listing them. But if you are moved by this evidence and you want to do something, you can simply go to AE911Truth.org right now. And what you can do tab is at the top. You just fill out the application. We will get in touch with you, and we'll get you involved on one of the many tasks that we need help with, and fill some positions that are greatly needed in this important and historic effort. And I want to second the importance of this event that we are doing in New York City on the anniversary. So if you can get out there and be a part of it, I certainly encourage you to do so. Back to you, Richard.
Great. And there's just so many things that everybody needs to be doing, including contacting your elected representative, contacting television, or tell them about the work of AE911, the Beyond Misinformation booklet, which I'm going to show you, screen the DVDs, which I'm going to show you some great examples of, and speak yourself to new audiences, invite people to your home and show them the work. To send the AE911Truth.org link to every architect and engineer you can find, and everybody else that you know. Send the PDF of Beyond Misinformation, our 55-page booklet, which pulls the rug out from the official story put out by NIST and shows the evidence for the explosive demolition. And you can get an e-version of this booklet or the hard copy, but the e-version will be sent on our website. If you're not on our website, simply go to Beyond. It can be sent to you right away. You'll list that way, and you'll know what we're up to. So what the application, it's unimpeachable. It looks at all this evidence you've been looking at today. Also, expose 9/11 myths in every region of the United States. Having completed our Southeast tour, following this Northwest tour you see here, with Eric Lawyer from Firefighters for 9/11 Truth and Unity, and myself laying out the evidence from the firefighters' perspective, looking fully at the National Fire Protection Association's Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigation. This video in its 1 hour free YouTube, or the 1.5 hour in our store. DVD is called 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out. We have 40 high-rise architects, structurers, chemists, physicists control the evidence. Again, available in the store in the 90-minute version in DVD, or you can watch it on YouTube in the 1 hour version. Here's the 2-minute trailer. Have a look.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how.
Center 7 collapsed because of fire fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is why NIST has ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed a petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, to sites.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition.
Zeker weten.
Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the document from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat
These present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres along the back of the actually found.
This is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
and
Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. And the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
Indeed, we want you to screen this film in your living room, at your local library. It covers all the evidence of weeks 1, 2, 3, and 4 of the webinar series, which we have just completed for the month of July, and we will start again next Thursday for the month of August. Today, we looked at the Twin Towers pyroclastic-like clouds, molten steel and iron microspheres, thermite, and nanothermite, which is a damning indictment of the official story. And next week we'll be back to week 1. Where we'll look at the overview of Building 7. Normal never brought down a high-rise. What is the example of the pyros, the foreknowledge of the explosives of this building, and the expert opinion. All of that, I believe. Don't we, Andy?
Yes, we do, and I apologize ahead of time if there is any difficulty with communicating. We're only going to do a few questions today because of some of the technical issues we're experiencing right now. And Richard, if you need me to repeat myself, I will. One question asks, in a YouTube video, there is a camera crew heading towards Tower 1 and are warned by some FDNY members to stay away because World Trade Center Tower 1 is leaning to one side. Have any evidence of this leaning just it says is there any evidence of this leaning just before it collapsed, and would this evidence, if true, help prove our case?
Well, I don't think evidence of such leaning would prove moves at the beginning, of course, the collapse of this building and the explosions. So now I'm not aware of this particular video, and I would love to ask the DNY member suggesting they stay away because it's leaning. We do know certainly that the evidence of the inward bowing of perimeter columns, which the official story blames on sagging floor trusses, which can't possibly be true. We looked at that last week. What can explain the inward bowing is the cutting or the support for those lightweight steel gauge, lightweight steel trusses, because they're pulling them downward, thus pulling in on the perimeter columns, thus causing their failure. That's evidence of explosive. And that is that in the massive antenna above the North Tower began to have a second the opening of the structure of the column, the hat truss immediately beneath it. So distant relation.
Okay, and then our last question for today says, the debunkers say that there was no aluminum as per Millet's report. My question is, Professor Jones looked further into the elemental aluminum question as he wanted to prove definitively the question around this. And these further tests in conjunction with the Bentham paper, he didn't find the proof of elemental aluminum, but said it could be in an amorphous form. My question is, does this affect the nanothermite conclusion, as the Bastille study is not published as of yet?
Just for some background information, the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal paper was indeed peer-reviewed and produced in 2006, I think it was. Following that, there's a lot of accusations by those who doubt its veracity, including named Millet, who did do his own analysis on some dust samples and did not find aluminum. And so I mentioned in the brief, his chips point of 420 degrees centigrade. Own reason, because that would be a very, very, it was done in one of the key proving elements that this these red grade chips are only it doesn't stay certainly required to be should become a peer-reviewed paper. By if I've said that right, solvent chips 6 times their size, which he did find in his chips. To common that's bound to other ingredients will stand with that as to the proof of aluminum as in the study, and the fact that it's not for inbound normal rocks, or contamination. It's very, very important. Cut fresh surface of it prior to your analysis, so that you can make sure that the chip is not contaminated with the other dust from the World Trade Center, such as gypsum board dust, which can contain some elements of aluminum as well. So that was ruled out. That contamination and the aluminum was found. And that's very important because aluminum is a key ingredient of thermite, as we've discussed. The Basil study is being performed by Mark Basil, and it has taken some time to put together, and we're looking forward to the results of his study. Of course, he's aware of all of these contrary to produce a study that clearly defines the argument according to the accusations of the critics, and any incompleteness on the part of the peer-reviewed paper by in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. So I hope that helps.
Okay, well, I want to thank everybody for tuning in today. As Richard said, we're going to be starting the whole series over again next Thursday. So please, if you're moved by this evidence, you can bring somebody that you want to see this evidence to view it too. So again, thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.
And thanks, everybody. We'll look for you on Thursday at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. We'll see you then.